Okay, so if there is no other question, I will start with today's lecture. And as I mentioned already, we are going to talk about the regulation, public sector intervention. So now we kind of let the state enter the discussion. So let's start with the notion of why we need regulation, why we need state or kind of government regulation. So here I will follow mainly the paper by Schleifer, which is in the references. Especially what he argues is that the standard rationale for state intervention in the economy is basically the public interest theory. So the idea is that government officials take public interest at heart. And there are, so basically the idea is that the private market can have some failure. So there is a market failure may exist, and there are two main kind of areas of market failure. So one is externalities, and the second is as a monopoly or monopolies. So can anybody have an idea what is an externality, or give me an example of an externality? So what is an externality, particularly a negative externality? Yep.
If, for example, a chemical firm is located at the river,
Yeah.
then this is a negative externality for all the people living there.
Yeah.
Or fish or...
Yeah, exactly. Can you give an example of a positive externality? Yeah.
Vaccinations.
Sorry?
Vaccinations.
In which because you vaccinate and then you protect the okay. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Okay, so you are familiar. So externality means that what you do has an impact not only on you but also on other people, other entities. And monopolies, I mean, you know what monopoly is, and monopoly can be natural or non-natural. So you basically some activities that we discussed. You remember the digital markets. We said in digital markets it's more common that natural monopoly arises, but you can also have monopoly for non-natural reasons. Namely, if there are restrictions or even anti-competitive behavior by some player. Sometimes it's also a state monopoly. So, I mean, in some cases, I mean, in my country, for example, the state had a monopoly on selling cigarettes, which is also a bit weird because cigarettes are also unhealthy. So some monopolies are really also due to barriers or other kind of non-economic reasons, but in many cases they are actually the result of competition. Sometimes the competition leads to only one player winning the competition, and in that case we have a national monopoly, but still a national monopoly is a problem because then we will go into that. So the other notion I want you to kind of keep in mind is that there are a lot of externalities in the economy, but we should not try to correct all of them. So basically, everything we do has some kind of externality. Okay, so it's impossible to have something. For example, I can buy a nice car. Other people may envy me because I have the car, for example. But that doesn't mean that we should also try to, in order to reduce the envy of the others, preventing me from buying the car, for example, or a nice bike or whatever. No? So there are many externalities. And certainly the government cannot correct all of them. So the question is, how do you pick the right externalities, which externality you should correct? And so there should be a high bar for the government to step in and try to correct the externality. They should be either very visible, very important. It should be clear that there is an externality. And we also keep in mind that government officials are not kind of holy people. They can be inefficient or corrupt, or also more often than not captured by the industry. Okay, so it's not that the government is always corresponds to the idea of a benevolent social planner which takes the public interest at heart. There are many more mundane reasons why government officials intervene. Okay, so public interest theory is the main justification, but high bar for correcting externalities. I mean, how high it is, of course, it depends also on the political situation, on your views about the market, the economy. I mean, in a communist country, the bar is lower. So the idea is that the government tries to correct a lot of externalities, and so there is a much more uniformity. For the one area, for example, where this discussion is important is income inequality. Okay, so if there is a lot of inequality of income, of course, this is a negative externality, because of course the rich consume a lot, and they are envied by the less rich, for example. No? And so should the government try to stabilize this, to reduce this difference? No? And some countries have different views on that. No? So in communist countries there is a much more uniformity. In capitalist countries, the States, for example, there is a much higher bar for intervention. So a much bigger income inequality is tolerated. Any questions on others? I mean, often these externality discussions are in the area of pollution or environment. Okay, so now what I also wanted to tell you a little bit about is the role of the state. So we are used to think that the state is the locus of sovereignty. So the state is sovereign, and this is also the case in the field of regulation. Okay, so the state is sovereign. So if a sovereign state takes a decision, normally it cannot be overturned by anybody. Okay, so here we are in Germany. The ultimate sovereignty belongs to the German state. Okay, the German state is able, for example, to limit our freedom. So if we do something against the German law, we can put in prison by German authorities and so forth. Okay, so these arrangement where the state is a place of sovereignty is called Westphalian order. So when you hear about the Westphalian order, this is what is meant. The state is the center of sovereignty. And the Westphalian order takes its name from the Peace of Westphalia. So this is a famous painting describing the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. And this is considered to be by historians the time in history when this kind of arrangement where the state, so it was basically the rise of the states in Europe. So we really had France, Spain, and so the authority was held by national states, which was not necessarily the case before. So before this Peace of Westphalia, perhaps I should put bigger. Sorry. Yeah. So before the Peace of Westphalia, a local prince, for example, could overrule the power of the state. So, from a German prince could make its own law, even in contrast with the law of the emperor. At the time, Germany was the Holy Roman Empire, for example. So, okay, so now after this, so this is now we are so used to this that is considered to be the standard, the national set, the national way things are. But just keep in mind that it was not always the case in history, and is not necessarily the case in the future either. So the idea that the state is a place of sovereignty. So, of course, you can invade states, but in general, still now the idea is that if a state takes a sovereign decision, it cannot be challenged by anybody. So, for example, if the state doesn't pay its debt, so if there is a sovereign debt crisis, because it's sovereign, nobody can actually force a state to pay back its debt. Okay, so when, I don't know, Argentina, for example, it makes made a default on its government debt, and nobody claimed that Argentina cannot do it because Argentina is a sovereign state. So nobody thought of invading Argentina just to get the sovereign debt be paid. Okay. There are other ways in which the creditors can try to get back their assets. So, for example, the creditor Argentina could try to seize Argentinian assets held abroad. This they could try to do. So this they tried. Okay, so if there was an Argentinian ship in a port outside Argentina, they could try to seize the ship, for example. No? But I mean, one fun example is that during this process of Argentinian default, I pick Argentina, but there are many other cases. Almost all countries have defaulted in history, including Germany, by the way. So the Argentinian president had to go to some international meeting, which I think was in Rome, and there were Italian creditors trying to seize Argentinian assets. So she had to fly with the Argentinian plane to Morocco, and then she had to leave the plane in Morocco, and then she flew with a normal airline to Rome, because she knew that if she landed with the Argentinian national kind of plane in Rome, they could have seized the plane. So the creditor Argentina could have seized the plane. Okay, so this is just, I mean, this is just an anecdote to say that sovereign debt is special. So you cannot have anybody, because if I default as a citizen, there is some state authority which may force me to pay back. But the same cannot happen with the state, because the state is sovereign. That's the idea. Okay, so why are we discussing this? And so the main reason is that this Westphalian order, which you should not take for granted, is challenged by digitalization. Because we already discussed that digital markets are global, they follow their own rules, they are online. So all this idea that the law is defined by the states is very much challenged by new developments. So digital currencies are a challenge for state authority, because they cross border very easily. They happen in a place which is not clear where it is. The actors that participate in these markets are not clear who they are, etc. So so many people say, okay, so we should use international cooperation more. So the states may make a coalition and have design the rules at the international level. And this, of course, can be done, has some potential, but also some limits, because you have to get sovereign states to agree on something. So because they are sovereign, they not necessarily have to agree. So the European Union in the world is the big example of basically supranational rules. So there is basically a setting where the Union has basically power in addition to the sovereign states. Okay, so you may know that from the European Union law is superior to the law of the member states. So if there is a European law, the European law overrides the law of the member states. So I think practically the only example in the world where the Westphalian order is overcome or is the European Union. Okay, which is also a source of endless discussions as well. But as a general principle, the European Union law is above the national law. So if there is a regulation on digital currencies at the European Union level, that is binding for all countries. At least in the European Union, it should be harmonized. Any questions? Have you done this discussion already? This discussion of Westphalian order? Because it's a typical international economics topic. Okay, so international politics and economics is a lot about how to make states that are sovereign cooperate, among them. Okay, so when we discuss about regulation, we have to keep in mind that, sometimes we have this idea that there is a bit of a trade-off. So there is a private market, there is a market economy, and then there are rules that kind of constrain the market economy. That's very much the idea that many of us have in mind. But we have to also to some extent, this is not exactly true. So it's certainly true that any market is not something that exists as a natural order. So it does not exist in nature, without a state authority or a government. But there are some things that are provided by a state or by an authority that actually allows a private market to exist and to flourish. And the chief among them is the protection of property rights. So if your property rights are not protected, it's hardly possible that the private market arises. Basically, it goes down as the law of the jungle. So the stronger can basically take away things from the weaker. Okay, so you need some degree of protection of property rights, of personal safety, I would say also, to have market to flourish. And I would put consumer protection also in the same category. So the idea that you cannot be subject to fraud, that if you sell something in the market, it should be truthful. So all these things, which are services provided by a state, are actually essential for markets to exist. So what I want to say here is that the idea that there is a kind of a competition between the state regulation and the market is wrong to some extent. So some state aspects are important for markets to exist. So this is a point that is now very little disputed among economists. So this should be read economists, not economics, economists. So these good institutions are important and useful, and the state plays a role. This, of course, doesn't mean that a bigger state is always better. So you can have a lean, a small state, guaranteeing these property rights and consumer protection. But what we've seen repeatedly is that the countries which have these good institutions actually have a much more vibrant, a much more functioning, better functioning private market, private economy. Okay, so and vice versa, countries that have no law and order are often countries where also private activity also flounders. So in Somalia, for example, where there is basically no state authority, there is hardly any market activity. So there is some, but for smaller things, or you can buy things, of course, food in the street and so on, but you can't really make transactions. So already, for example, real estate transactions are very hard to do if there is no land registry, for example. So many of these private transactions actually exist for, against the backbone of a state institution. And there is a lot of literature in economics about. There are measures of good institutions in countries, and there is a lot of literature saying, these measures are important for economic growth, for income levels, and so on. So countries with good institutions do better also in economic terms. Okay, are you familiar with this literature? Yeah.
What does it mean that it doesn't exist in a vacuum?
So it is. Sometimes you get the idea that the private market is something that is natural, that comes from a natural world that we would naturally do, coming from nature. While what they mean here is the market. Any market exists within a set of rules. So there must be rules of the game that define the market. It's a bit similar to. If you want to have a soccer game, you need to have a referee or some rules. Otherwise, it declines into chaos. That's the idea, basically. So a private market without a set of rules descends into chaos and doesn't work. Okay, so you need these minimal sets. So when we discuss about regulation, I probably mean something that goes beyond that minimum. Okay, so whether the state should regulate, over and above. Its role to provide protection of property rights and some minimal rules of the game. Okay, other questions? Okay, so I discussed externalities. So how do we deal with externalities? So here, so the example is a classical one. A firm produces a chemical and pollutes a river. So how do we deal with that? And as I said, there are tons of examples of things like that. Okay, so there are basically you can build a case of whatever we do has some externality. It's really always like this. Okay, so there's hardly any case in our life that doesn't create some type of externality. Sometimes it's a positive externality, sometimes it's a negative externality. So what are the policy options? And they come here a bit in a spectrum. So from less to more government intervention. So you could basically do nothing, and doing nothing means that basically this externality goes below the threshold of what externality should be corrected, and that of course is a function of a cultural environment. Probably 30 or 40 years ago, the pollution of the river was not considered to be a big problem. Now, our environmental sensitivity is much higher. So now we would consider polluting the river as a very important problem. So it depends a bit on how thinking or opinions evolve over time, and there is a lot of change. This also just as an example. So everything which is related to morality and things like accepting bribes and so on, is rightly much more strict now. Okay, so I remember when I was a student or even a high school student. There were many more scandals that were very tolerated. So now things that happen then now will not be accepted now. So this standard evolves over time. Okay. The second solution, which is associated with the name of Roland Coase. So Roland Coase is a famous paper in 1960. I guess some of you must have studied this, and is a classic of student economics. Is that you could have a private solution to this problem, to the problem of externalities, whereby you let private citizens compensate each other. So the idea here is that a firm, so suppose that there are 10 people living along the river, the firm pollutes the river, but then pays the people who live along the river for the damage created by the pollution. Okay, so this is the private solution, the Coase solution. The other slightly different, but still a little bit more in the direction of government intervention solution, is basically to make a law that polluting a river is wrong, and then you let citizens use courts to settle their rights. So if cities, the beauty of this solution is that automatically you get a higher bar for correcting externalities, because going to courts is costly. So you would only do it if you really care about a problem. Okay, so you don't do things. So if polluting the river is very, very important for you, then you go to court. But if you don't care much about it, then you don't go to the courts, and the courts don't have to work unnecessarily. So that's a bit the idea that due to the cost of using the courts, that sets the right bar in terms of what externalities are corrected and not corrected. You still need a law. You still need a law, but the actual compensation, the actual application of the law is left to citizens using the courts, the tribunal, to settle their rights. Okay, so that's. So people in favor of this option, they say, okay, this is efficient because of the cost of using the courts, not all externalities are corrected. Of course, those who are against this say, but then you let a lot of injustice go unpunished because people are difficult to use the courts. Yeah. And there is also a natural tendency of people not to go to court. It is also very different among people. So we know, for example, that lawyers are much more likely to go to court than others. So why give lawyers an advantage? I don't know if any of you is a lawyer. Yeah. So there is. I read somewhere that actually also in medical practice, doctors do less doubtful procedures on lawyers, because they know that they can be sued by lawyers. So if they do something wrong in terms of surgery and so on, they know that it's much more likely that lawyers will sue them. And so it's been shown that there is a study, I think in Switzerland, showing that doctors are much less aggressive in their treatment with lawyers than with non-lawyers. It gives you a bit of an idea of that using courts is not an obvious thing to do in terms of which access you have to courts. And the fourth and more intrusive solution to correct externalities is to actually regulate directly. So the state says here, this is what you should do. For example, you should not pollute a river, or you can pollute a river only up to a certain point, or tax the production of the chemical. So because this is what is called sometimes Pigouvian tax. So the Pigouvian tax is a tax that tries to correct an externality. Okay, so the Pigouvian tax is often mentioned as way that the state can regulate activities, and is also mentioned a lot now in the area of climate change. So people say, a lot of people say, we should have a Pigouvian tax on carbon. Okay, so we should tax emissions because there is a negative externality. So if I produce something, I put CO2 in the atmosphere. The atmosphere creates a greenhouse effect. So this is a negative externality for everybody. So the planet warms, and so on. So we should tax the production of CO2. Okay, so that is a Pigouvian tax. The most extreme case of regulation is state ownership. So the state becomes the owner of the activity, and here the idea is that it becomes the owner of activity because it wants to pursue some social objective. Okay, so some general objective. So the private actor is not able to internalize this externality, so that's why the state has to take. So you can argue, for example, the national defense must be taken over by the state because a private contractor will never take all these externalities into account. Okay, so you need a state because this becomes a bit of a public good. I mean, of course, the most extreme case of positive externality is a public good. So the public good is something that is, by definition, full of positive externality. Any question on this externality dimension? Okay, now we will come to the digital currency and the externalities, but okay, so one aspect of externality that is very important in the area we are covering, which is digital assets, is financial stability. So financial stability is very high in the mind of regulators. So it's not easy to define financial stability. So I would define it as basically having orderly credit conditions. So the main function of the financial sector eventually is to provide credit, and the provision of credit can be hampered, so can be either too easy or too tight. Okay, so what typically happens in history is that after a while there is a financial crisis, which can be also a banking crisis or also a non-bank crisis as well, a currency crisis. And the result of this crisis is typically a big limitation, a big crunch in the provision of credit. So what typically, and there are a lot of articles and books on that, but I make it very short. But basically what happens is that there is a period of very low price of credit, so very low risk premium. So even if I'm a risky borrower, I get credit because risk aversion is low. But then after a while, this becomes unsustainable. So leverage builds up. Okay, so the financial institution become over leveraged, and something happens, and then there is a crisis. And then the risk premium jump up. They go from very low to very high abruptly. So this is a crisis episode. And then if I'm a good borrower, if I'm a safe borrower, I cannot get any credit. Okay, this by itself also feeds into the economy, creates a recession, and then the recession and the lack of credit interact with each other, and they create a crisis. So this financial crisis, again, common in history, and it's also very costly in terms of output. Okay, so economic activity contracts, and then it takes a very long to recover. Okay, can you mention a couple of examples of financial crises that you know? Where there are many cases.
Right now? Right now?
Which breakdown?
I'm saying right now.
Right now, sorry, right now. Right now there is a crisis. Would you say there is a financial crisis now?
Well, first there is inflation in many countries.
Mm-hmm. That's for sure.
Yeah, and then you can say about 2008 crisis.
Yeah, that is a more classical example, I would say. Yeah. I mean, now is a bit. I would personally, I wouldn't say that there is a financial crisis now. There is a situation of high uncertainty and inflation. So there is, I would say, a risk of a crisis.
Yeah.
but I don't think there is a crisis right now. So it's still, so credit is still flowing nicely and so on. But of course, it could change. Now this could change. Yeah. So this, we are a bit on a kind of maybe on the cusp of some crisis episode, but for the time being, we don't have it, fortunately. Other examples, other parts of the world.
Great Depression.
Yeah, Great Depression. I mean, this is the most classic example, 1929, 1932. There was another famous one in Asia. Does anybody remember the Asian financial crisis?
1990.
Yes, that is. So it was 1997, 1998. There was the Asian financial crisis. It's another famous. Argentina had several financial crises. Argentina is one of the most crisis-prone countries. Yeah. I mean, there are other. There was a big banking crisis in Scandinavia in the 90s. So Sweden, Finland. Yeah. So there are also online databases of crisis. If you are curious if your country experienced a crisis or when, there are databases of crisis. So dummy variables. This is a year of a crisis, not crisis. Okay. So this is about financial stability. So regulators in this area obviously want to prevent a systemic. So systemic means that the system as a whole is not only about a single institution going down, but is basically a generalized problem with many institutions. So what happens often in crisis is that also many banks fail or go bankrupt, okay, or many financial institutions, not only one, but many. So that's why it's called systemic, because it's a system as a whole. So the banking system as a whole is over leveraged, and then basically in the crisis state, the price of credit goes up, banks have to deleverage, and many of those banks also fail. Okay, so there is this kind of snowballing effect on failing banks. So that's why it's called systemic risk. Okay, so it's the risk of a collapse of the system as a whole. So that's why regulators have financial stability in mind. So they have, for example, bank capital regulation. So you know that banks have to hold a minimum capital, so a minimum of all resources. This is important to limit the leverage of the banks. Okay, so the banks should not be over leveraged, and for this reason we have this bank capital regulation. So so each individual bank has this bank capital requirement, and this is basically is again preventing a negative externality. So it's about the failure of one bank kind of damaging or kind of jeopardizing the stability of the whole system. So creating a systemic risk. Okay, so from one bank to the whole sector, or also from one sector to the whole economy. I mean, the financial sector is key for the economy, so it's particularly regulated because it's so key. So you can have failure in other sectors. So if the car sector, if there is a big failure in the car industry, that is by itself is not a big problem for the economy as a whole. Actually, for the existing companies in that sector, can even be positive. Okay, so if a car producer disappears, the other car producers gain. Okay, and not much happen. But this is typically not the case in the financial sector, in particular in the banking sector. So if there is the failure of a big bank, this can create a banking crisis, and a banking crisis has negative effects on the whole economy. So the banks are really at the core of the economy. So if the banking sector doesn't work, the whole economy doesn't work. So some economists said that the financial sector is the brain of the economy. So if you shut down the financial sector, you shut down the brain of the economy. So credit is not allocated, deposits, money, and everything that is the center of all economic activity, essentially. Okay, so systemic risk is. So now we are getting close to digital currency. So I think one big area of government concern would be that if these currencies create a financial stability risk, that would be a way in which regulators would be concerned about them. Okay, so this would be a channel of interest for those regulators. Any question on financial stability? somebody said that the task of a guardian of financial stability is very hard, because you either, if you do something and then you prevent a crisis, then nobody will tell you thank you because the crisis didn't not happen. But if there is a crisis, then they will tell you ex post that you are stupid because you are did not prevent a crisis. So whatever happens, you lose. That's why they are probably well paid to compensate for that. Okay. Now, let's go, let's deal with the second issue. And I told you the rationale for regulation in terms of public interest is, remember, is externalities and monopolies. Okay, so now we discuss externalities, now let's discuss monopolies. So what is the problem with monopolies? The problem is that the monopolies can extract rents from institutions. So it can extract extra profits that you pay as consumer. And the result of this is that you have lower output and higher prices compared with the situation of competition. So any service that is provided under monopoly is characterized by higher prices and higher costs for consumers. Okay, so this is economics 101. It can be shown also graphically that the equilibrium for a monopoly implies a rent for the monopolist. So the monopolists get the profits, but the consumers pay the price. That's why it's generally bad to have a monopoly. There is another aspect which also is important, which is the operational risk. So if there is only one supplier of something, that if that supplier has a problem, then the whole economy may have a problem. I think if there is only one supplier of electricity, then if that only supplier has some kind of problem, then you have a blackout and the electricity disappears. Okay. So this is an example. So there are some crucial sectors that may disappear if one provider doesn't provide, for some reason doesn't provide. While if you have 2 or 3 providers, at least one can jump in for the other. But if it's only one, then just to say, for example, there are very few credit card providers. It's a very concentrated market. There are only 2 or 3 big providers. So if one of them goes down for operational reasons, many payments cannot be done. So if the Visa system goes down, this creates an operational risk for the whole economy because many payments cannot be done, because it's so concentrated. So as a result of these concerns, antitrust is a central function of a modern state. So all modern states have some antitrust authority. So antitrust is basically to combat monopolies and to make sure that there is enough competition. There is a lot of literature and doctrine on antitrust, how antitrust should be done, what is competition. Some people argue that even if you are in a monopoly situation, you can still have competition. So if you misbehave, somebody else can jump in and take your place. So the fact that there is only one provider doesn't mean that there is no competition. So this is how sometimes monopolists argue. So for example, in the area of web search, Google would say, yes, we are monopolists, but we are monopolists because we are better than the others. If we were worse, others would take our place. So there is competition, just you don't see it because we have won the competition. Okay, so it's just to say that it's not easy to assess a situation where there is no competition, but that's the job of the antitrust authority. So it's a difficult job, and it requires a lot of economic knowledge. There is also in the area of antitrust an interesting trade-off with investment innovation. So here the idea is that suppose that suppose that there are also economies of scale, for example. So the bigger you are, the more innovative you are, and then you can become dominant. If you have a strong antitrust, then this dominant player, which could be the most innovative, could not reap the benefits of its innovation. So this could discourage innovation. So one of the theories of why, for example, the US has more innovation than Europe is that it also has a weaker antitrust. So Europe has a strong antitrust function, and some people say it discourages the creation of very large innovative firms because whenever you become dominant, the antitrust authorities would try to break you down or make you pay fines, etc. So, but this I don't think is the main reason, but it has been argued in this context. So the bigger point is that some activities, as we discussed, may be national monopoly, so they may just arise due to network externalities. So in some cases, there is just demand for one thing, for one service, and that's the nature of the situation due to network externalities. So why should an authority prevent this, which is in a sense is a free market solution? So why should the authority prevent that? No? So the question of how to deal with national monopoly is a big question. I mean, it's difficult to define a national monopoly, of course, but it's also difficult to understand what to do with a national monopoly. So what probably most sophisticated antitrust economists would say is that you have to, first of all, always to have if you have a national monopoly, you always have to guarantee there is at least a possibility of entry of somebody else. So the incumbent may be dominant, but can always be possible for somebody to enter. And these monopolists should not abuse the position of power. So a lot of the antitrust activity is about preventing abuse of the dominant. It's not really about dismantling or canceling a dominant position, but it's not abusing that dominant position. So, for example, if that's a typical case, that if Google, that is dominant in search engines, makes in its search function makes only searches appear to favor firms that are also related to Google. Or put in another way, suppose that Google is in competition with another firm, and you use a Google search, and that firm is not identified by the Google search systematically. That is an abuse of dominant position. Okay, that would be fined by the antitrust authorities, because basically Google should not abuse its dominant position to favor itself or to disfavor competitors. So it should always be possible for competitors to compete on fair grounds with a dominant provider. Okay, so antitrust is a very interesting and sophisticated activity for government regulators, government officials. Any other example that you know on antitrust? Have you encountered anything or read about it? Yeah?
For instance, I remember a firm which was producing cancer-treating medicines,
Mm-hmm.
and its strategy for a while, I think, was basically provided these medicines to a country, then basically didn't provide them anymore, went to another country, provided them there, and then came back and provided them at a much higher price.
Mm-hmm.
And this was, I guess, going on for quite
Yeah.
some time.
Yeah. Yeah, of course, I mean, the medical sphere is another sphere of this antitrust. I mean, also think in terms of COVID vaccines. I mean, they will all be provided by two or three firms. That's another case of how you prevent this from being a mono. So how do you define? I mean, of course, I mean, take a firm like Pfizer for the COVID vaccine. They can say, yeah, we got the vaccine, others didn't, so we should reap the benefits. But still, I think an antitrust authority should take an eye on that, because if they said, yeah, I increased these to crazy prices, or suppose that, I mean, just I'm making it up, but suppose that Pfizer said, if you take my vaccine, you can never take later the Moderna vaccine. Then this would be an abuse, because then basically Moderna could not compete with Pfizer on fair grounds. So this is what the antitrust authority will look at, more than preventing Pfizer from being dominant. Yeah. So it requires a lot of sophisticated thinking. So that is very interesting. By the way, what is interesting, antitrust is the only state function, together with monetary policy, that is centralized at the European level. So it's a European competence. So the antitrust authority for Europe is the European Commission. There are also national antitrust authorities, but they have to work in liaison with the European Commission. Okay, so the antitrust is European function, like monetary policy. So these discussions are done in the Commission, where there is a directorate for competition called DG Comp. So this is all where all discussions are done. Okay. Okay, then there are, with thinking about regulation, there are also some other important discussions. So one interesting discussion is activity versus institution. So you can regulate I mean, I think the standard kind of approach is to say, I regulate an activity wherever this is done. So same risk, same regulation, or same activity, same regulation. So if, for example, the regulation for banks, if I am a non-bank financial institution, but I do an activity that is very similar to what banks do, then I should be regulated like a bank. Okay, that's the standard approach. But also now there is an interesting discussion for firms that do both financial and non-financial activities. So take, for example, big techs. So the big techs they have a financial and non-financial part. Take Facebook / Meta. Suppose that Facebook had established the Libra stablecoin. Of course, Facebook would still be a non-financial firm mainly. So here, we say the non-financial part can impact on the financial part. So it's not clear that Facebook would have to be regulated like a bank, because Facebook has this big non-financial part, and if there are problems in the non-financial part, this can impact also the financial part of Google. So this is true for all these conglomerates. So there is a discussion now that this principle of same activity, same regulation is not necessarily true for large firms that have basically where a problem in the institution can spill over to another part of the institution. So even if they do things right on financial activities, they may still do things wrong in the non-financial part, and then this still would not be good regulation, because then this non-financial part can impact negatively the financial part. So I just want to mention there is this discussion of whether you should regulate the activity or you should regulate the institution. By the way, one thing that I probably didn't tell you when we discussed big techs is that they are also very big. So the big techs are much bigger than even the bigger financial institutions. So the big techs in terms of market capitalization are maybe 5 times bigger than the biggest banks. So these are really very, very large firms. So you can see why also they are systemic. Yeah.
What does locus mean?
The place of regulation. So basically what you should regulate. So sorry, it's a bit of a Latin word. So this place of regulation. So basically the question is, should you regulate the activity, whoever does it, or should you regulate the institution that does it? Yeah. Then there are other relevant aspects of regulation. So if you are a good regulator, you should avoid cliff edges. So you should be gradual and proportional in your regulation. So this is a discussion which, for example, comes up often in the pension system. So pension rights often have steps. So things change. So say if you are born in a certain year, or you are born in the following year, then your pension rights could change dramatically. So there is a pension reform, for example, in a certain year, and then workers that start working before the reform have certain rights, And then 1 year later, 1 year after the reform, the workers who just happen to start working in the following year, they have completely different rights. Okay, so this is a type of cliff edge. Is a type of thing that you should, if you are a good regulator, you should try to avoid. Okay, there should not be cliff edges, so they should be more gradual. Okay, so the difference in regulation should be tailored to the difference in the situation. It should not be like a step. No? So this is also, again, in some sectors, pensions and others is a big concern that you treat people who are very similar, you treat in a completely different way. Okay. So that's so in my country, for example, there was a pension reform in the 90s, and basically just the people before and after the reform were treated completely differently. So if you start working in 1994 or 1996, you had completely different pension rights, and that is what should not happen. Okay, so it should be more gradual and proportional. Second aspect, minimize compliance costs. So this, especially the bank regulation, is very complex, and in some cases it requires a lot of compliance costs. So the famous case is U.S. bank regulation comprises several thousand pages. So if you are a bank, you should learn a lot of things, fill a lot of forms and so on. So that's also a bad thing to have. So it should be easy to follow through. Regulatory arbitrage, and I have a slide on that. So you should be aware and possibly avoid regulatory arbitrage. And then there should be also global cooperation. So if different countries have completely different regulation, because many of these financial institutions are global, that's also a bad thing. So there should be some degree of global cooperation. So different countries should not have completely different rules, because then there will be an invitation to regulatory arbitrage. So what is regulatory arbitrage? So when regulating an activity, there is always the risk that the same activity migrates to a less regulated part of the system. Okay, so if you impose a strict regulation on something, say, coming back to the polluting the river example, so if you say you can't pollute the river, but then you don't say that you can't pollute a lake, then the factory will migrate near a lake and they start polluting the lake. If the rules says that the lake can be polluted and not the river, for example. So what happens in practice is that activity may migrate between institutions. So banks are very regulated. Non-bank intermediaries much less regulated. So if you become even tighter in terms of regulating banks, so if you have stricter banking regulation, many activities migrate to the non-banks. So they start to be done. Similar activities start to be done in non-banks where there is less regulation. The other example is geographical. So if you have a lot of regulation in a country, then activity goes into another country where there is less regulation. So there is always a tendency for activity to migrate in places where there is less regulation. This phenomenon is called regulatory arbitrage. So this is something that prevents very tight or costly regulation, because you know that when you impose very costly regulation, activity migrates to other places where there is less regulation. So, and the good regulator should be able to internalize that. So they should know that, that this is the case. In the area of big tech, for example, high regulation in the banking sector may open the door for big tech in the same sector. So if big tech is less regulated, then it's an open invitation for many activities to migrate from banks to the big tech, until the regulator also regulates the big tech as well. But there is always a delay. And yeah. Any question on arbitrage? This is an important point. Keep in mind. Okay, and then there is a question of innovation. So the question is, if you have a new activity or something you don't know it will work, should you try to regulate the new activity? So what is the relationship between regulation and innovation? So the general principle I would say is that regulation follows innovation. So it's not efficient to regulate all innovations, because not all of them may survive. Okay, so an example. So when railways were established in the 19th century, there were a lot of accidents and not much regulation of how railways should be done. So basically it happened so fast that the state could not keep up with, and they didn't know what exactly what railways would survive and so on. So basically the activity came first and the regulation came later. So over time, railways became much safer because then there were rules on how a railway should be done, safety measures and so on. But at the beginning, it was extremely dangerous. So there were a lot of train accidents, trains going out to the railways, etc. Okay, so this is just an example to say that often the best solution is there are innovations. You see whether the innovations survive, they're successful, and only if they are well established, then you regulate. So if you over-regulate all innovations, many of them will not survive. So first of all, it's useless to regulate things that will not survive, and second, also regulation may itself make them not survive. Because at the beginning, something is more fragile. It needs time to grow up, no? And if you kill them early by overburdening them with regulation, they will never become successful innovation. So here is the second bullet point: regulation should not suffocate innovation. And so one tool that is used more and more is called a regulatory sandbox. So this is a sandbox. So the sandbox is a place where you can experiment safely. I don't know if you remember that when you were kids. My kids had this kind of thing. And so the idea is that the regulator provides a controlled environment where a new activity or something innovative on experiment can be done in a controlled way. Okay, so you relax regulation, but you do that in a controlled environment. Yeah, and this is the idea a bit of experimentation, and I think that in China this is done very very much. So the Chinese have these special zones where regulation is less strict. So they want to see how things work on a controlled scale, in a smaller scale, before then, if it works, then extend this to the whole country. So that is for the special zones in Shanghai, or is a typical Chinese approach, done by experimentation, and actually I believe it should be done more also in Europe. So this idea of trying things on a smaller scale, and then see, we lose a regulation, and then if then it works on a smaller case, then roll out in a bigger way, and in that case, then think about proper regulation, but only then, not at the beginning. Any question on sandboxes? So this is a term which is used a lot also in the digital world to have. These regulatory sandboxes. So try things in a controlled environment. So for example, central banks are trying blockchains as a regulatory sandbox. So they try how blockchain works in a controlled environment. So they run experiments also. Regulating big techs. So some issues which are specific to big techs. So anti-competitive practices. I mean, this we discussed already. So that some of these big techs are so dominant that they can prevent competition. So they have these. These big techs, they have this walled garden ecosystem. This means basically that. And again, this is a question which also goes back to the question of state authority and Westphalian order. So we are used to think that basically the constituency is a citizen of the state. No? So the citizens of Germany must have access to some service. But suppose that the real community is not the citizens of Germany, but is the users of Facebook. That is a different group of people. So. You can have basically, so suppose that Facebook issued a stable coin. So the stable coin will be used by Facebook users, which are a transnational group, it doesn't necessarily overlap with the citizens of a country. So you could have basically Facebook and non-Facebook users in Germany. So in the same country, there could be two groups of people. So the people who are in Facebook are not in Facebook. And that completely conflicts with the idea that it's the citizens of a state who are subject to some regulation or can have access to some activity. Okay, so this is so these kind of closed ecosystems of the users of a certain platform, which excludes the other users in a country. Big concern with, in particular, with big tech hoarding of user data. So protection of the data. So these firms tend to keep and sell your data. So how to prevent that? And finally, operational vulnerabilities. So what happens if one of these big techs that are so big, so important, what happens if one of them goes out of operation? So for example, if I mean, you remember when WhatsApp had a problem, there was panic, because WhatsApp is now so dominant in terms of messaging and so on. Okay, let's come to the digital currency. So this was a big introduction to come to this, which is why should we regulate private digital currencies? So why should we regulate stable coins and crypto? So I think the rationale is a bit different. Sorry. So in the case of stable coins, the biggest concern maybe is monopoly rents. So if these stable coins are issued by a big tech, and in these stable coins, if one stable coin becomes dominant, then you have all the issues of monopoly rents and all the problems related to monopoly. So this is probably the issue number one that you want to deal with, and maybe antitrust is not well equipped to deal with that. So a general concern is that antitrust has a harder job in the digital world, partly because it's a natural monopoly, partly because it's harder to track, to measure. So the antitrust authorities struggle with the digital world, with digital services. So if one provider becomes dominant, it's going to be hard for the antitrust regulator to follow that. The other aspect is the financial stability aspect. So we discussed that these stable coins have a peg, but we also discussed that the peg is not stable all the time. So there could be, remember we discussed the risk of digital runs. So the fact that basically there's a sudden collapse of the peg. So the stability of value of the stable coin. And if this stable coin becomes dominant in payments, for example, then a sudden collapse of the peg, so a sudden depeg of the stable coin becomes very, very important, very, very, very hard to deal with. Data privacy is a key concern for stable coins. So can we protect the data? Can we prevent abuse of the data? Remember we discussed that payments provide a lot of data. So can we prevent these big tech companies from selling all this data to others? And in the case of stable coins, this is relatively uncontroversial. It's important to prevent fraudulent behavior and make it, so if an issuer of stable coin says that the stable coin is collateralized, so if it is basically backed by reserves, somebody should be able to check and to audit that this is true. So we should basically is a big function of a state to prevent fraud and to make sure that that what is revealed to consumers is truthful. So there is a truth in what they say. So I think the last bullet point I would say is relatively clear that is a state function. So this is for stable coins. For crypto, for example, Bitcoin, the issue is a little bit different. So I think here the financial stability rationale is still a bit unclear. So crypto is still, as we discussed, a relatively small part of the financial system. So it's not still not big enough for one to be worried about financial stability. So for the time being, it's still a bit unclear whether one can use the financial stability argument to provide a stronger regulation of the crypto ecosystem. But it could be, no? If it becomes more important, if it becomes even bigger, or if some institutions have a lot of exposure to the crypto world, then it's still possible that this financial stability argument could be used. And the other big concern for crypto is the prevention of illicit transactions. So it's easier to run illicit transactions using crypto than in other ways, for obvious reasons, because it's decentralized. But again, so the who defines what is illicit? It's maybe illicit from the point of view of a certain state, but it also can be argued that is also a defense by citizens against the power of the state. So suppose the power of the state is capricious, and the state is illiberal. Is it morally justified that these transactions cannot be carried out? So again, we are at the conflict between basically the digital world, which is has rules on its own, and the state authorities, which follow still the old logic of state sovereignty. So how do we square that aspect? Perhaps a third argument, which I forgot a bit to mention here, is also the environmental aspect. So crypto is very environmentally unfriendly. So we discussed that this mining of Bitcoin takes a lot of computing power. So that could be another reason for regulating, is to prevent basically damage to the environment. I guess this is less often done, but I guess could also be argued that it's a negative externality created by the existence of crypto. So and because this is actually a defining feature of crypto, so crypto must use consuming computer power. So it's a defining feature of the system. Is something that unavoidably comes with crypto. So it's a negative externality that needs to be managed by the existence of cryptocurrencies. Any questions on this part? Okay, so but we have to be aware. So I just described the rationale of why a state might want to regulate the digital currencies, but there are also a lot of challenges. So the fundamental challenge, or the fundamental question, is whether is that it's not clear if the state can actually rule the internet. And this is an old discussion that goes back to many years ago. So is the internet free from state intervention? I guess some people could say, okay, so the state does not rule the internet, but the state, of course, has authority on the actors, which can be persons or institutions that participate in the internet. So the state may not have authority of how the internet is run, but if I, as a European citizen, participate in an online transaction on the internet, I am subject to the law. Okay, so that is a different. So there are things on the internet that the state cannot ban, but still the state can prevent me from doing that. Okay, so I can. I don't know. So the state may not prevent, for example, selling of weapons on the internet, but also it can prevent me as a citizen from buying a weapon on the internet. Okay, so the regulation, the locus regulation, the place regulation is the person and not the code, the computer code. But nevertheless, there is a discussion, in particular in the area of blockchain and distributed ledger technologies, whether there can be a contrast between the rule of law, which again is based on state authority, and the rule of code. So if it is an algorithm that runs blockchain, is the algorithm subject to the law? The algorithm is just an algorithm, so it's not a physical or institution. It's not a physical person or institution. So how can a code be subject to the rule of law? And I guess the related question is, can the rule of code, so what is embedded in the blockchain in terms of automatic algorithm, can it be in contrast with contract law? So if if the code something that the civil code does not allow or doesn't foresee, can the code be made illegal? So I guess the question is, can you rule a code? And remember we came back to the question. You remember we discussed artificial intelligence. So is artificial intelligence subject to the law? It's not clear, no? So how can a software be subject to the law? Also, there are other specific problems associated with blockchain that make state intervention difficult. So one is that, remember the blockchain is not, it's something that can also have local copies. So the beauty of the blockchain is that it's public. So everybody can see it. And so everybody also can make local copies of blockchain. So if there is something illegal or illicit happening on that blockchain, that needs to be corrected. There is not only one blockchain, but can be thousands of blockchain copied on different computers, possibly also in different countries. Okay, so it's something. If the German authorities decide this transaction of blockchain is illegal, we have to remember that there are thousands of copies of the blockchain which can be in China, in India, in Russia, or in Australia. Okay, so this problem of the local copies is important. And the other, remember that the one key feature of the blockchain is that transactions cannot be reverse exposed. Okay, so it's technically impossible. It's in the nature of the blockchain. So if one of those transactions is later found to be illegal, it's still not easy to reverse it. So if one of these transactions is that I buy a rifle with that in that transaction. Then a policeman comes and says, why did you buy a rifle? We are not in Texas, we are in Europe. Then, yes, I may be punished for buying a rifle, but the transaction whereby I bought a rifle cannot be reversed. So, yeah. And the general problem is that how can you regulate an entity where there is no issue? Again, the question of place or locus of regulation. So by definition, Bitcoin has no issuer. So who is the subject of the regulation? There is nobody. It's a code. Again, it's a string of letters and numbers. So what exactly are you trying to? So my answer would be that you always try to regulate the actors, so the institutions and the people who are actually participate in this blockchain, but it's much harder to actually regulate the software itself. And finally, obviously, you have a high risk of regulatory arbitrage and of suffocating financial innovation. So if for example, Europe says, yes, now I don't allow blockchain to take place anymore in Europe, then the activity will simply migrate somewhere else. So there's plenty of opportunity. So even some countries, for example, have banned Bitcoin mining. So China has banned Bitcoin mining, for example, and then activity simply migrates somewhere else. So it's not so easy to ban things. When things are so mobile. By definition, the digital world is stateless, is beyond borders. Any question on this? Yeah.
So the German government decides tomorrow that the Germans can't trade or be in possession of Bitcoin anymore. Where do you think can a German regulation enter? What's like the most efficient way, or is it even possible to do so?
So if the German state does that, I would say still is not a regulation of the blockchain, because the blockchain will continue to exist. Is a regulation of the citizens having or not access to the blockchain. So it's a different thing, no? Then the question is, can this ever be monitored or implemented? Maybe not even possible, but. I guess with a high investment in policing, yes, it would be possible. Of course, if they control your computer access, they monitor you with hidden cameras and so on. But it would require a big investment on monitoring you. So it could not be done on a scale of millions. It could be done in small scale. So they could always track. If they have some suspicions about you, they can always track you, more carefully. But but I think it would be very hard to do it on a big scale. So yeah, but again, so this is a regulation of the people. It's not a regulation of the blockchain itself. Yeah.
If they control all the transactions, doesn't what is the difference between US dollars and Bitcoin? Then it's against the nature of the decentralized system, right? If
Yeah.
you regulate it, then
No, it's true. Exactly. So the question is more the distributed ledger or the blockchain than the currency used for that. I mean, the difference could be that if you have to use a US dollar, eventually there will be some US institution subject to US regulation involved. So at the end of the day, there will be some control of the, because at the end of the day, something will have to be settled with the US financial institution that is subject to US regulation. So I think I would say the US has more power to prevent a transaction where the US dollar is involved, because then they can always. So first of all, if there are sanctions on Russia, they can always say any transaction. So the US dollar cannot be used in any transaction with Russians, and if this is not done, then the institution cannot. There is no US financial institution that can deal with the dollar transaction if a Russian citizen is involved. So in that sense, I would say. So that's why Bitcoin escapes that, because in Bitcoin you don't have this step of having, basically the US dollar transaction is subject to because it's done normally by a financial institution which is subject to US regulation. But with the Bitcoin you don't have that. Yeah. But in general, however, I agree that the key issue needs to be more the blockchain. It's just the way the transactions are done, more than the currency in which they are done, in general terms. But of course, having the dollar makes the US dollar this more powerful to affect the transaction. Any other question? I mean, there is a discussion among the lawyers on these questions, and it's very interesting. But in my view, the fundamental question is really, how can you regulate a software, a code, and that's really the. I mean, think of artificial intelligence. How do you regulate artificial? If artificial intelligence means that it can also learn by itself, develop by itself, then how can the law control what artificial intelligence does? No, yeah. Because I guess the similar reasoning. The law doesn't control what animals do. They may control what the owners of animals do. So they don't. The law doesn't control what the dog does. Is the owner? They may say the owner of the dog may put something on the is it called mouth of the dog and so on, but the law cannot say the dog should not bite anybody or something, because the law is addressed to people. No? So. Okay, final slide. CBDC. So all these private digital currencies are a potential threat to monetary policy, to central banks. And this is, in my view, much more the case for stable coins, less so for crypto, because stable coins are potentially stable store of value, and they are in possible competition with state-backed fiat money. So this could challenge monetary sovereignty. So suppose, for example, a dollar-denominated stablecoin, a dollar-pegged stablecoin is used in Europe. So this means that essentially that the US dollar will be used in transactions in Europe rather than the euro. So these basically the ECB would lose monetary sovereignty, and there would be like currency competition within Europe. So these are, you may imagine that central banks don't like that. Plus all the issues we discussed before, the data protection and monopoly rents would be also main concerns if a stable coin were to be established. So all these fears have led to the push for central banks to issue their own digital currencies in competition with the private supplier a little bit. So this is what the CBDC, the central bank digital currency, tries to do, and next week we'll have a lecture on CBDC. But here, the idea is that the state, in a sense, or the central bank of the state, competes with a potentially dominant private supplier. So why does it want to do that? It prevents monopoly rents. So if you believe that the dominant private supplier would be a monopolist and the antitrust authorities don't manage that, then having the state compete with the monopolist could be a way to reduce the monopoly rents. It offers an alternative to citizens. So suppose that you don't like the stable coin, you have an alternative. And then the question is it a complement or a substitute for regulation? So some people say, if there is a regulation of stable coins, why having a CBDC? If it is properly regulated, then no CBDC. Other people say regulation may be more effective, so they are complements, because with the threat of a CBDC or a competition CBDC, the provider of a stable coin would be less safe or less monopolist and would be more ready to follow regulation or to be regulated. So that's, or at least it would be less powerful and it would be easier to regulate it. So there are different discussions on that, whether it's a complement or substitute for regulation. But this is the second. So I would say there are two responses to these challenges. One is regulation, still very difficult, as we discussed just now. The other big response is to provide central bank digital currencies. Okay, so now we are moving in that direction now in the course to discuss about central bank digital currencies. So this is the reaction of central banks to this competitive threat. Any final question? Okay, so again, sorry for the recording of the Zoom lecture. I will learn next time. And so we see each other next week then. Okay.